At her funeral in England, senior members of the British royal family were present, a quiet acknowledgement of who she had once been before her remains were interred in the royal cemetery at Tatoy. They had not come to bury a suburban housewife. They had come to bury the last surviving great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, born to the title of princess. Inside that simple oak casket lay Her Royal Highness Princess Katherine of Greece and Denmark, a woman whose veins carried the blood of the czars and kaisers, the sister of 3 kings, and a royal refugee who had spent 60 years hiding her true identity from the world. Katherine's life was not a fairy tale. It was a terrifying lesson in the lethal weight of a crown. She did not live in palaces. She watched them burn down in assassination attempts. She did not rule. She stood shivering on the decks of exile ships, while her father, the king, died of a broken heart, and her brothers were crushed by a throne that destroyed everyone who sat on it. While her cousin Philip married a queen to secure a dynasty, Katherine made the most radical choice of all. She walked away. She voluntarily stripped herself of her royal title to marry a commoner, trading the highness for a wedding ring and the terror of history for the safety of anonymity. This is the untold autopsy of the princess who decided that the only way to win the Game of Thrones was to stop playing it. The woman who was born a deity but fought to die as a nobody. Katherine was born into a terrifying high-stakes theater, far removed from the stable, stolid continuity of the British monarchy. She belonged to the House of Glucksburg, a dynasty that sat on the Greek throne not by ancient blood right, but by invitation, an invitation that could be revoked at any moment. The Greek monarchy was essentially an ejection seat. Her father, King Constantine, was a man ruling a volatile, passionate, and deeply divided nation that existed in a perpetual state of geopolitical vertigo. Katherine arrived in this world on May 4th, 1913, at the Royal Palace in Athens. Her birth was hailed as a crowning glory for the dynasty. Her father, Crown Prince Constantine, was at the zenith of his popularity. He was the eagle, the soldier king, who had just led the Greek armies to a stunning, miraculous victory in the Balkan Wars. He had liberated Thessaloniki. He had doubled the size of the Greek state. The Athens that Katherine opened her eyes to was a city drunk on victory, awash in blue and white flags, convinced that a new Byzantine empire was dawning. She was the Benjamin of the family, the youngest of 6 children, a baby girl born into a golden haze of national euphoria. But looking back with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that the gold was fool's gold. The air in the nursery where Katherine slept was already thick with the static electricity of the coming storm. Her genetic heritage alone was a map of the conflicts that were about to tear the world apart. Her father, Constantine, was Greek in his heart but Danish and Russian by blood, a man of autocratic instincts trying to rule a democracy. But it was her mother, Queen Sophia, who embodied the tragedy. Sophia was a princess of Prussia, the sister of Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. She was also the granddaughter of Queen Victoria of Great Britain. In her veins, the blood of the 2 future enemies, Britain and Germany, flowed in a tormented mix. Sophia was a woman of iron discipline, raised in the rigid, hypermasculine court of Berlin, yet she possessed the Victorian sense of duty and emotional complexity. She was formidable, intelligent, and deeply, dangerously German in a country that was increasingly looking toward the British and French for protection. For the first few months of Katherine's life, the illusion held. She was the cherished baby, the pet of the family. Her siblings, George, Alexander, Helen, Paul, and Irene, were already older, a boisterous, tight-knit clan who doted on the new arrival. Photographs from this brief, sunlit prologue show a chubby, smiling infant in lace, held in the arms of a mother who looked stern but fiercely protective. The family spent their time between the formal, drafty royal palace in Athens and Tatoi, the beautiful estate in the foothills of Mount Parnitha. Tatoi was their sanctuary. It was a place of pine forests, olive groves, and vineyards, a private kingdom where the king could be a father and the queen could be a mother. It was the place where Catherine took her first steps on soil that she believed belonged to her family forever. But the guns of August 1914 shattered the silence of the Tatoi woods, even though the fighting was thousands of miles away. When Catherine was just 15 months old, the First World War erupted. It was the catastrophe that would define her life, the event that turned her family from national heroes into political hostages. The war presented Greece with an impossible suicidal choice. The British and French, the Entente powers, demanded that Greece join the war against Germany and Austria-Hungary. But Catherine's father, King Constantine, knew that the Greek army, exhausted from the Balkan Wars, would be annihilated. He also knew with a chilling prescience that if Greece entered the war, it would be torn apart by internal divisions. He argued for neutrality. He wanted to keep his small, fragile country out of the meat grinder. However, his prime minister, the charismatic firebrand populist Eleftherios Venizelos, saw the war as a golden opportunity to expand Greece's borders even further. He wanted to join the British, and he had a powerful card to play, the Queen. Venizelos and his supporters began to whisper and then to scream that the king's neutrality was not strategic but personal. They claimed he was refusing to fight because he was beholden to his wife, the Kaiser's sister. They painted Queen Sophia, Catherine's mother, as a German spy, a traitor in the heart of the palace. The national schism had begun. It was a civil war of the soul that split Greece right down the middle. You were either a royalist or a Venizelist. Families stopped speaking to each other. Officers in the army drew guns on one another in mess halls. In the nursery, the atmosphere changed. The relaxed, happy chatter of the servants was replaced by hushed whispers and fearful glances. Catherine, now a toddler, would have sensed the tension in her mother's body, the rigidity of her father's jaw. The crowds outside the palace, who had cheered for the baby princess in 1913, were now gathering to chant slogans against the German woman. The British and French press launched a vicious propaganda campaign against Queen Sophia, calling her a Boche agent who was poisoning the king's mind. Imagine the psychological impact on a child growing up in a house where the mother is being hunted by the hatred of millions. Catherine was learning her first lesson in royalty. The love of the people is a vapor. It can evaporate in an afternoon, leaving only the hard rock of resentment. The tension exploded into violence in 1916. Catherine was 3 years old. The incident that occurred that summer was not just a political event. It was a primal trauma that would sear itself into her consciousness. The family was at Tatoi, seeking refuge from the stifling heat and the even more stifling hatred of Athens. It was supposed to be safe. Tatoi was their home, their private land. But the hatred had followed them into the forest. On a dry, windy afternoon in July, a fire broke out in the woods surrounding the estate. It was not a natural fire. It started in multiple places simultaneously, a classic sign of arson. The tinder dry pine trees exploded like bombs. The wind whipped the flames into a wall of fire that raced toward the main house with terrifying speed. The alarm was raised, but the fire was moving faster than the servants could run. King Constantine, realizing the mortal danger, did not wait for his guards. He grabbed the 3-year-old Catherine in his arms. Queen Sophia grabbed the other children. This is the scene that must have played on a loop in Catherine's nightmares for the rest of her life. being bounced in her father's arms as he ran through the burning woods, the heat searing their skin, the smoke choking their lungs. The roar of the fire was deafening, drowning out the screams of the staff. The king, the queen, and the children were forced to run for miles, abandoning the house to the flames. They eventually found shelter in a dry riverbed, huddling together as the inferno raged over their heads. 18 people, loyal servants, soldiers, and estate workers, died that day, burned alive trying to protect the royal family. For a 3-year-old child, this was the end of the world. The sanctuary was gone. The smell of burning pine, the black ash falling like snow, the terror in her father's eyes. This was the moment Katherine understood that there was no safety. The palace walls could not protect them. The king could not command the fire to stop. They were vulnerable. They were prey. The fire at Tatoy was widely believed to be the work of the king's political enemies, a murderous message sent by the secret police of the Venizalist faction or French agents. It was an assassination attempt that masqueraded as a wildfire. The family returned to Athens, shaken and traumatized, but the nightmare was only accelerating. The British and French, frustrated by Constantine's refusal to join the war, decided to use force. They blockaded Greece, cutting off food supplies. The people of Athens began to starve. Katherine, though shielded by the last remnants of palace luxury, would have seen the gaunt faces of the staff, the thinning of the meals. The great powers, the family of her own mother, were starving her people to force her father's hand. In December 1916, the violence reached the palace steps. A French naval force landed in Athens to seize control of strategic points. Greek royalist troops resisted. A battle erupted in the streets of the capital. This was the Noembriana. Shells from French warships fired into the city. Bullets smashed into the facade of the royal palace. Katherine and her siblings were moved to the cellars. Imagine the scene. The great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, sitting in the dark on a crate of wine or a pile of coal, listening to the dull thud of artillery destroying her city. She was a princess of the blood, but in that cellar, she was just a frightened child waiting for the roof to cave in. The resistance of the king was futile. The Allies were determined to remove him. In June 1917, the ultimatum was delivered. King Constantine must abdicate or Athens would be bombarded until it was rubble. To save his people, Constantine agreed to leave. He did not officially abdicate the crown to his enemies. He stepped aside, leaving his second son, Alexander, as a puppet king, while he and the rest of the family went into exile. The departure from Athens was a funeral procession for a living family. On June 14, 1917, the 4-year-old Katherine was dressed in her traveling clothes. The crowds that gathered outside the palace were not the angry mobs of the propaganda posters. They were the loyalists, the common people who loved their eagle. They surrounded the cars, weeping, trying to stop the vehicles from leaving. They threw flowers. They kissed the hands of the king. It was a chaotic, hysterical scene of grief. For a child, it must have been terrifyingly confusing. If they love us so much, she must have wondered, why are we leaving? Why is Papa crying? They were driven to the port of Oropos and put on a small steamer, the Sphacteria. As the ship pulled away from the dock, cutting through the sapphire waters of the Aegean, Katherine stood on the deck, watching the coastline of Attica recede. She was leaving behind her toys, her bed, her pony, and her brother Alexander, who stood on the pier looking like the loneliest man in the world. She was crossing the line from royalty to refugee. The concept of home was dissolving behind the wake of the ship. The family traveled to Switzerland, the traditional waiting room for unemployed European royalty. They settled in a hotel in St. Moritz and later in a villa in Zurich. The contrast was brutal. They went from the Mediterranean heat and the emotional intensity of Athens to the cold, orderly gray silence of the Swiss Alps. Switzerland was safe, but it was the safety of a sanatorium. For Katherine, the years in Switzerland were a study in melancholia. She watched her father, the man who had been a colossus in uniform, shrink into a civilian suit. King Constantine sank into a profound depression. He spent his days pacing the hotel rooms, smoking endlessly, reading the newspapers that called him a traitor, and staring out at the indifference of the Swiss lakes. He was a lion in a cage, stripped of his purpose. Her mother, Queen Sophia, held the family together with a Prussian rigidity that barely masked her own heartbreak. She had to manage the finances, which were becoming precarious. They were living on limited funds, relying on the charity of wealthy Greek expatriates. Katherine was the bright spot in this gloomy exile. She was the sunshine of the family, a precocious, observant child who learned early on that her job was to cheer up her parents. She learned to navigate the volatile moods of the adults, to be quiet when Papa was sad, to be dutiful when Mama was stressed. She was being trained not in the art of ruling, but in the art of emotional survival. She saw that being a king or queen was not a fairy tale. It was a burden that could break a human being. But the Greek tragedy has a habit of producing plot twists that defy belief. Just as the family was resigning itself to a life of permanent exile, fate intervened with a capriciousness that was almost cruel. In Athens, Catherine's brother, the puppet king Alexander, was living a lonely, miserable existence, controlled by the Venizelist government. On October 2nd, 1920, he was walking his dog in the palace gardens when a domestic monkey, a macaque belonging to the palace steward, attacked the dog. Alexander jumped in to separate them and was bitten on the leg and the stomach. It seemed like a minor injury, but the wounds became infected. Sepsis set in. In 1920, without antibiotics, this was a death sentence. Alexander, the 27-year-old king of the Hellenes, died in agony on October 25th. It is said that Winston Churchill later remarked, "It is perhaps no exaggeration to remark that 250,000 persons died of this monkey's bite." He was referring to the chain reaction that followed. Alexander's death created a vacuum. The Venizelist government, arrogant and overextended in a new war with Turkey, called for an election, confident they would win. They lost. The Greek people, exhausted by war and missing their eagle, voted overwhelmingly to bring King Constantine back. And so the suitcases were packed again. The 7-year-old Katherine was pulled out of her Swiss school. The family boarded a train, then a ship. In December 1920, they arrived back in Athens. The reception was hysterical. The same crowds that had been silent 3 years earlier now screamed, "He is coming!" The city was illuminated. People unhitched the horses from the king's carriage and pulled it themselves to the palace. Katherine waved from the carriage, a small figure in a sea of adulation. It felt like a triumph. It felt like the natural order had been restored. God had put the king back on his throne. But Katherine, with the instinct of a child who has seen the fire, must have felt the fragility of it all. The restoration was built on a lie. The Greece they returned to was not the victorious nation of 1913. It was a country on the brink of a catastrophe. The army was deep in Anatolia, fighting a war against the Turkish national movement led by Mustafa Kemal that it could not win. The treasury was empty. The Allies, Britain and France, still hated Constantine and refused to support him. The family moved back into the palace, but the ghosts were everywhere. They visited the grave of Alexander at Tatoi, the brother Katherine had barely known, now buried in the soil that had once burned. The shadow of the war in Asia Minor hung over everything. Katherine's father was forced to go to the front to lead the army in a desperate attempt to secure a victory. He left a sick man and returned a broken one. The catastrophe came in 1922. The Greek front in Asia Minor collapsed. The Turkish army swept toward the sea. The city of Smyrna, a jewel of Hellenism, was burned to the ground. Hundreds of thousands of Greeks were massacred or forced to flee. It was the Asia Minor catastrophe, the death of the great idea of a greater Greece. And the blame fell squarely on the shoulders of King Constantine. The army revolted. A military coup, led by Colonel Plastiras, demanded the king's abdication. This time, there was no polite request. There were firing squads. The Revolutionary Committee began arresting politicians and generals, lining them up against the wall at Gudi and shooting them. The king was told to leave immediately, or the palace would be stormed. For the 9-year-old Katherine, this was the final shattering of childhood. The night they left in September 1922 was not a procession. It was an escape. There were no cheering crowds. There was only darkness and fear. They were smuggled out to a steamer, the SS Patris. As they boarded, the king was so ill he had to be carried. Queen Sophia was stone-faced, her eyes dry, her heart surely turned to ice. Katherine stood on the stern of the ship once again. She was old enough now to understand what was happening. She knew that men were being shot in Athens. She knew that her father was being called a murderer and a traitor. She watched the lights of Greece fade into the black water, and she realized that the restoration had been a cruel joke. They were not royalty, they were wreckage. They were being cast out, not into a waiting room this time, but into a void. The ship turned west toward Italy, carrying a dying king, a humiliated queen, and a little girl who had just learned the most dangerous lesson of all, that a country is not a mother who holds you, it is a lover who breaks your heart. The wake of the ship did not just churn the dark waters of the Aegean, it churned the very soul of the dynasty. As the SS Patris plowed westward, putting miles of sea between the family and the firing squads of Gudi, the adrenaline of the escape began to curdle into a heavy, suffocating dread. The physical danger had passed, but the psychological amputation was just beginning. For Katherine, standing on that deck, the silence of the open sea was a terrifying counterpoint to the chaos she had just survived. She was moving from a world of noise, gunshots, shouting crowds, weeping servants, into a world of quiet hotel rooms and whispered conversations. The curtain was falling on the dramatic first act of her life, but the intermission would offer no relief. It would merely set the stage for a tragedy more personal and more devastating than the loss of any throne. The ship docked in Palermo, Sicily, in the autumn of 1922, disgorging its cargo of shattered royalty into the harsh, bright light of Italy. For the 9-year-old Katherine, the arrival was not a relief. It was a transition from terror to a suffocating, grieving silence. They checked into the Villa Igia, a hotel that had seen better days, much like the family that now occupied its suites. The atmosphere was funereal. King Constantine, the eagle of the Balkans, the man who had once commanded hundreds of thousands of men, was now a ghost haunting the hotel corridors. He was only 54 years old, but he looked 80. The stress of the wars, the betrayal of the Allies, the hatred of his own government, and the agony of the exile had ravaged his body. His heart was failing, his arteries hardening under the pressure of a grief that no medicine could cure. Katherine watched her father die by inches. It is a specific trauma for a child to witness the invincibility of a parent evaporate. In Athens, he had been a figure of bronze and marble. In Palermo, he was a man who sat in a chair, staring at the sea, weeping silently for the country that had rejected him. He spoke little. What was there to say? He had given everything to Greece, and Greece had sentenced him to death in absentia. On January 11th, 1923, just 4 months after their flight, The end came. King Constantine I of the Hellenes died in a hotel room in a foreign land, an exile stripped of his crown but not his dignity. For Catherine, this was the moment the universe fractured. Her father had been the sun around which her chaotic life revolved. He was the one who had carried her through the fire at Tatoi. He was the one whose hand she had held on the deck of the Sphacteria. With him gone, she was truly adrift. The funeral was a stark, melancholy affair in the crypt of the Russian Orthodox Church in Florence. There were no state honors, no weeping crowds of Athenians, no salutes from the batteries of the Acropolis. There was just a small group of exiles in black coats, shivering in the Italian winter, bearing a king who was officially branded a traitor by the government of his homeland. Catherine stood by the grave, a 10-year-old girl holding the hand of her mother, Queen Sophia, whose face was hidden behind a heavy crepe veil. She was learning that in the 20th century, kings do not die in glory, they die in disappointment. With the king gone, the family was decapitated. But Queen Sophia was a granddaughter of Victoria. She did not crumble. She possessed the iron spine of the Hohenzollerns and the stoicism of the Saxe-Coburgs. She gathered her children, Katherine, Irene, and Helen, and moved them to Florence, to the Villa Sparta. This house, a sprawling Renaissance villa in the hills of Fiesole, would become the stage for the next act of Catherine's life. It was a beautiful sun-drenched sanctuary, filled with the scent of cypress and lemon, but it was also a gilded cage of genteel poverty. The years at Villa Sparta from 1923 to the early 1930s were the crucible that forged Catherine's character. To the outside world, they were the glamorous Greek royals living a romantic, bohemian life in Tuscany. But the reality was a constant struggle to maintain appearances on a shoestring budget. They were poor relations in the grand European royal network. They relied on the generosity of friends and the sporadic financial help from the British royal family. Catherine wore clothes that had been turned and mended. They had servants, but they were often old retainers who worked for loyalty rather than wages. Yet, in this strange, suspended animation, Catherine found a kind of happiness. Villa Sparta was a house of women. Her sister Helen, the Queen Mother of Romania, had fled her own disastrous marriage to the playboy King Carol II and joined them. Her sister Irene was there. Together, they created a world of art, music, and gardening. Catherine, free from the stifling protocol of the Athens court, was allowed to breathe. She discovered a talent for painting. She ran wild in the Tuscan hills with her nephew Michael, climbing trees and scraping knees like a normal child. She was the Benjamin, the baby, protected by the fierce love of her mother and sisters. But the shadow of politics was never far away. The villa was a meeting point for the displaced flotsam of European royalty. Uncles and cousins would pass through, telling stories of other revolutions, other escapes. Catherine sat at the dinner table, listening to the adults speak of the Bolsheviks who had murdered her mother's Russian cousins, the Romanovs. She heard about the rise of Mussolini in Italy, the man whose black-shirted thugs were marching through the very streets of Florence where she shopped. She was growing up in a master class of geopolitical instability. She learned that nothing is permanent. Thrones fall, borders move, money vanishes. The only thing that matters is the family unit. It was during these adolescent years that the pull of England began to exert its gravity on Catherine. Her mother, Queen Sophia, though German by birth, was culturally Anglophile. She spoke English to her children. She raised them on English nursery rhymes. And she decided that Catherine, the youngest, should have the stability of an English education. Catherine was sent to North Foreland Lodge, a boarding school in Kent. This was a revelation. Katherine moved from the chaotic, emotional, tragic atmosphere of the Greek exile to the orderly, damp, sensible world of the British upper class. She loved it. She loved the uniforms. She loved the hockey matches. She loved the fact that in England, the king sat securely on his throne, the buses ran on time, and nobody was shooting politicians in the street. She spent her holidays with her British cousins, including the family of King George V. She saw what a functioning monarchy looked like. Boring, perhaps, but safe. It was at North Foreland Lodge that Princess Katherine began to fade, and the sensible, practical Katherine began to emerge. She shed the melodrama of her Balkan heritage and adopted the stiff upper lip of the British. She realized that she preferred the quiet dignity of the English countryside to the dangerous passions of the Mediterranean. But death, the constant companion of the Greek royal family, struck again. In January 1932, Queen Sophia died of cancer in Frankfurt. Katherine was 18 years old. She had now lost both parents. She was an orphan of the exile, a young woman with a grand title, a famous name, and absolutely no home. The death of Sophia was the end of the Villa Sparta era. The matriarch was gone, the sisters scattered. Katherine was now truly alone, reliant on the kindness of her brothers, George and Paul. For the next 3 years, Katherine lived the life of a royal nomad. She traveled between London, Florence, and the homes of her sisters. She was a perpetual guest, the little sister who had to be looked after. It was a lonely existence. She was a princess without a kingdom, a woman without a dowry, existing in the twilight world of the Almanac de Gotha, the directory of European royalty that was becoming increasingly irrelevant in the modern world. She watched as Europe darkened again. Hitler was in power in Germany. The Spanish monarchy fell. The world was holding its breath. And then the pendulum of Greek history swung back with its usual violent unpredictability. In 1935, the Greek Republic, plagued by coups, counter-coups, and economic incompetence, collapsed. The people, forgetting the anger of 1922, remembered the stability of the monarchy. A rigged plebiscite declared a restoration. Katherine's brother, George II, was invited back to the throne. Imagine the surreal nature of this moment for 22-year-old Katherine. She was being told to pack her bags and return to the country that had killed her father, exiled her mother, and burned her childhood home. She was going back to the scene of the crime. Most people would have refused. But for royalty, duty is not a choice. It is a genetic imperative. She boarded the ship with her brother. The return in November 1935 was a bizarre mirror image of the return in 1920. Once again, the crowds cheered. Once again, the flags waved. But Katherine was no longer a child. She looked at the faces in the crowd and she did not see love. She saw fickleness. She knew that the same people throwing flowers today could be throwing stones tomorrow. She stood on the balcony of the palace, a young woman in 1930s fashion, waving to the masses. But her eyes were guarded. She knew this was a performance, one of the first acts of King George II upon his restoration was a grim piece of theater that must have chilled Katherine to the bone. He ordered the bodies of their parents, King Constantine and Queen Sophia, to be exhumed from the crypt in Florence and brought back to Greece for a state burial at Tatoi. In November 1936, Katherine stood in the freezing wind at Tatoi, the same estate where she had almost burned to death 20 years earlier. She watched as the coffins of her parents were lowered into the Greek soil. It was meant to be a moment of healing, a symbolic closing of the wounds of the national schism. The king stood there, grim and silent. The Crown Prince Paul stood there, and Katherine stood there, the orphan daughter finally bringing her parents home. But as the earth covered the coffins, Katherine must have felt the heavy irony of the moment. They were burying the dead in a place that was not safe for the living. The Europe around them was preparing for a slaughter that would make the First World War look like a skirmish. To the north, the Nazis were rearming. To the west, Mussolini was dreaming of a new Roman Empire that included Greece. The family had been restored to the throne just in time to face the apocalypse. Life in Athens between 1936 and 1940 was a strange, tense interlude. Katherine took on the role of the dutiful princess. She worked for charities. She visited the sick. She tried to reconnect with a country she barely knew. She learned the language again, forcing her tongue around the complex vowels of Greek. She tried to love the people, but she always kept a part of herself in reserve. She was the quiet princess, the one who didn't give interviews, the one who stayed in the background. She watched her brother George II struggle to rule a country that was ungovernable. He established a dictatorship under General Metaxas to keep order, a move that made the monarchy secure but unpopular. Katherine lived in a state of high anxiety. She saw the diplomatic cables. She heard the arguments at the dinner table. She knew that war was coming. She watched as her cousin Philip, a tall, blonde naval cadet, visited Athens, full of bravado and youth. She looked at him and wondered if he would survive the coming storm. She looked at her brothers and wondered if they would end up like their father, exiled and broken. And then the clock struck midnight. On October 28, 1940, the Italian ambassador woke Prime Minister Metaxas in the middle of the night to demand surrender. Metaxas gave the famous answer, "Alors, c'est la guerre." The Greeks simplified it to a single word, oxy. The sirens wailed over Athens. For Katherine, it was the sound of her childhood returning. The cycle had restarted. The peace was over. She was 27 years old, and for the third time in her life she was at war. But this time, she did not run. Not yet. The invasion of Greece by Mussolini's fascist army was the moment Katherine finally stepped out of the shadow of her victimhood. She put away the tiaras and the silk dresses. She put on the uniform of a Red Cross nurse. The war in the mountains of Epirus was brutal. The Greek army, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a ferocity that stunned the world. They pushed the Italians back. It was the first Allied victory of the Second World War. Katherine threw herself into the war effort with a desperation born of trauma. She visited the hospitals. She saw the frostbitten limbs of the soldiers who had fought in the snows of the Pindus Mountains. She sat with boys who were dying of gangrene. She wrote letters for illiterate peasants to their mothers in the villages. In those hospital wards, smelling of disinfectant and blood, Katherine shed the last layers of her royal distance. She was no longer the foreigner or the German woman's daughter. She was a Greek woman suffering with her people. For a few brief, shining months, the monarchy and the people were one, united in a defiant struggle against fascism. But it was a doomed struggle. In April 1941, Hitler grew tired of Mussolini's incompetence. He unleashed the Wehrmacht on Greece. The German war machine, fresh from conquering France, rolled through Yugoslavia and smashed into the Greek defenses. The outcome was never in doubt. The panzers were unstoppable. The order came to evacuate. The word evacuate is a sterile euphemism for the panic and heartbreak of fleeing for your life. On April 22, 1941, Katherine stood in the garden of the royal palace in Athens. She could hear the distant rumble of artillery. She knew the Germans were only a few days away. She had to pack a suitcase. What do you take when you are losing your world for the third time? Photographs, jewelry, warm clothes? She joined the convoy of cars heading south to Crete. The king, the crown prince, the whole family was running. They boarded a British flying boat at dawn. As the plane lifted off from the water, Katherine looked down at the Acropolis, glowing pink in the morning light. She saw the swastika flag that would soon fly over the Parthenon. She was leaving behind the graves of her parents at Tatoi, leaving them to the mercy of the invaders. They landed in Crete, hoping to make a stand, but the Germans launched an airborne invasion. The sky over Crete filled with paratroopers. It was a slaughter. The royal family was forced to hide in cellars, in caves, moving at night to avoid the Luftwaffe patrols. Katherine, the granddaughter of Victoria, was sleeping on the dirt floor of a shepherd's hut, listening to the sounds of men killing each other in the olive groves outside. In May 1941, with the island falling, they were evacuated by a British destroyer, HMS Decoy. The ship zigzagged through the night to avoid the U-boats and the Stukas. Katherine stood on the deck, salt spray on her face, exhausted, dirty, and homeless. She was 28 years old. She had survived the fire. She had survived the first exile. She had survived the death of her father. She had survived the second exile, and now she was surviving the third. The destroyer carried them to Alexandria, Egypt. But Egypt was too dangerous. Rommel's Africa Corps was knocking at the door. The British government decided to move the Greek royals to a place of absolute safety, far away from the war zones. They were to be sent to South Africa. The journey to South Africa was a voyage into the unknown. Katherine was stripped of everything that defined her. She was a princess without a country, a nurse without a hospital, a woman without a home. But as the ship crossed the equator and headed toward the Cape of Good Hope, Katherine felt something strange stirring inside her. It was not despair. It was a kind of liberation. In Athens, she was Her Royal Highness. In London, she was the king's sister. But in South Africa, who was she? She was about to find out. The years in Cape Town would be the lost years of her official biography, but they would be the most important years of her personal life. It was there, under the Southern Cross, thousands of miles from the burning ruins of Europe, that Katherine would finally stop being a character in a Greek tragedy and start becoming a human being. She would take off the mask of royalty and find the face underneath, and she would discover that the woman she found was stronger, simpler, and far more interesting than the princess she had left behind. That voyage to the southern hemisphere was a crossing of the river Styx in reverse. She was traveling from the land of the dead, a Europe consuming itself in fire, to the land of the living. As the gray, submarine-infested waters of the Atlantic gave way to the azure brilliance of the Indian Ocean, the claustrophobia of the bunkers and the caves began to lift. The ship was carrying her away from the history that had tried to kill her family for 3 decades. It was carrying her toward a blank page. When the imposing silhouette of Table Mountain finally pierced the horizon, rising like a fortress at the end of the world, it signaled a pause in the relentless drumbeat of terror. For the first time since her birth, the roar of history stopped, and in the silence that followed, Katherine finally had permission to exhale. Cape Town in 1941 was a world away from the smoking ruins of Crete. It was a place of blinding light, of Table Mountain looming over the sea like a prehistoric altar, and of a silence so profound it must have rung in Katherine's ears. For the Greek royal family, or the royal refugees, as they were whispered about in diplomatic circles, South Africa was meant to be a gilded cage, a safe harbor where they could be parked until the war was over. The British government had sent them there not just for safety, but to get them out of the way. In the complex chessboard of Middle Eastern politics, a king without a country was an inconvenience in Cairo or Alexandria, so they were shipped to the bottom of the world. For most of the family, this exile was a purgatory. Her sister-in-law, Crown Princess Frederica, chafed against the boredom, plotting the return to power with a frantic energy. Her brother Paul paced the gardens of the governor's mansion, listening to the radio for news of the resistance in the Greek mountains. But for 28-year-old Katherine, South Africa was not a cage, it was a chrysalis. It was here, stripped of the court protocols that had defined her existence since birth, that the princess finally evaporated and the woman began to solidify. She moved into a modest house in Cape Town. There were no ladies in waiting to dress her. There were no guards to salute her. There was just the sun, the wind, and a desperate need to be useful. Katherine did not sit on the veranda drinking tea and mourning her lost status. She went to work. She volunteered at a St. Dunstan's hospital for the blind. This was not the ceremonial charity work of a princess who visits a ward for 20 minutes to accept a bouquet of flowers. This was real, grinding, physical labor. She wore a crisp white nurse's uniform that stripped her of her rank. To the soldiers lying in the beds, men blinded by shrapnel in the deserts of North Africa or the jungles of Burma, she was not Her Royal Highness. She was simply Sister Katherine. There is a profound psychological shift that happens when a royal serves the common man intimately. Katherine fed men who could not feed themselves. She read letters to men who would never see their wives again. She held the hands of boys screaming from the phantom pain of amputated limbs. In the darkness of those wards, the artificial barriers of class and bloodline dissolved. Katherine realized a truth that would guide the rest of her life. Dignity does not come from a title. It comes from connection. She found she was good at it. She had a calming presence, a soft voice, and a deep well of empathy forged by her own traumas. For the first time in her life, she was valued not for who her great-grandmother was, but for what her hands could do. It was also in South Africa that she formed a friendship that expanded her mind. She became close to Jan Smuts, the Prime Minister of South Africa. Smuts was a philosopher-soldier, a man of immense intellect and vision. He saw past the shy exterior of the Greek princess and recognized a sharp, curious mind. They would take long walks up Table Mountain, discussing philosophy, botany, and the future of the world. Smuts treated her as an equal, as an adult capable of understanding the complexities of the war. He gave her the confidence to trust her own judgment, to see beyond the narrow horizon of dynastic duty. Katherine was growing up. She was shedding the skin of the victim princess and becoming a woman of substance. But the war, like a receding tide, eventually turned. By 1946, the guns had fallen silent in Europe. The Nazis were defeated. The world was waking up from the nightmare, only to find itself broken and scarred. For the Greek royal family, the end of World War II did not mean peace. It meant a different kind of war. Greece had descended into a vicious civil war between the communists and the royalists. It was a bloodbath of unimaginable cruelty. Her brother, King George II, was fighting to return to his throne, but the country he wanted to rule was a charnel house. Katherine looked at the reports coming from Athens, the massacres, the starvation, the hatred, and she made a quiet internal decision. She could not go back. She could not face the cycle of exile and restoration again. She had seen the fire at Tatoi. She had seen her father die of a broken heart. She had run from the Stukas. She was done running. She wanted solid ground. And for a descendant of Queen Victoria, solid ground meant only one place: England. In 1946, Katherine boarded a ship not for Athens but for London. She arrived in a city that was victorious but exhausted. London was gray, bomb-scarred, and rationed. The tea was weak, the coal was scarce, and the fog was thick. But to Katherine, it smelled like freedom. She moved into the house of her mother's family, the Kensington Palace apartments of the Duchess of Kent. She reunited with her cousin Philip. The relationship between Catherine and Philip is a fascinating study in contrast. They were first cousins, both grandchildren of King George I of Greece. They had both been carried out of Greece in exile. They had both lost their true homes. But in 1946, their trajectories were crossing in opposite directions. Philip, the ambitious naval officer, was climbing the ladder of royalty, preparing to marry Princess Elizabeth and become the consort of the future queen. He was embracing the institution. Catherine, the weary survivor, was looking for the exit door. She was watching Philip step into the gilded cage just as she was trying to pick the lock. It was in this post-war London autumn, amidst the drab reality of coupon books and smog, that Catherine met the man who would offer her the escape she craved. He was not a prince, he was not a duke, he was not even a very rich man. He was Major Richard Brandrum, an officer in the Royal Artillery. Richard was the antithesis of the men Catherine had grown up with. He was not volatile like the Greek politicians. He was not neurotic like the Habsburgs or Romanovs. He was solid. He was a rugby player, a war hero, who had won the Military Cross for bravery in Northwest Europe. He had a quiet, self-assured masculinity that didn't require a sash or a medal to validate it. When Catherine met him, likely at a social gathering of the interconnected web of London society, she saw something in him that she had never seen in the palaces of Europe: safety. The romance was quiet and swift. It was not a fairy tale passion played out in the tabloids. It was a meeting of souls who were tired of the noise. Richard offered Catherine a life of aggressive normality. He offered her a garden in the country, a Sunday roast, a dog by the fire. To a woman who had spent her life sleeping in exile hotels and dodging bombs, this was more romantic than any crown. But there was a problem. A princess of Greece and Denmark marrying a Major Brandrum was, in the rigid hierarchy of 1947, a mésalliance. It was unequal. According to the Royal Marriages Act and the complex statutes of the Greek royal house, she required permission. And the timing was terrible. Her brother, King George II, had just died of a heart attack in Athens, and her other brother, Paul, had ascended the throne. The Greek monarchy was fighting for its life against the communists. For a Greek princess to marry a British commoner at this precise moment could look like an abandonment of her duty, a signal that the ship was sinking. Catherine found herself in a familiar position, trapped between her heart and her history. But this time, she did not fold. She had the steel of the South African years in her spine now. She wanted Richard. The solution came from a man who understood the burden of duty better than anyone, her cousin, King George VI of Great Britain. The king, a kind and pragmatic man who was fond of Catherine, saw a way to cut the Gordian knot. He understood that Catherine needed to live in England and that she needed to be happy, but he also knew that she couldn't float around London society as Her Royal Highness Princess Catherine, while married to a retired major working in the city. It would be awkward for protocol. Who would bow to whom? So a deal was struck, a piece of constitutional wizardry that allowed Catherine to vanish in plain sight. King George VI issued a royal warrant. It was a document of transformation. In it, he granted Catherine the rank, style, title, and precedence of the daughter of a duke. This sounds like a technicality, but it was a profound identity shift. By accepting this, Catherine was agreeing to a demotion. She was voluntarily stripping herself of her royal status. She would no longer be Her Royal Highness. She would no longer be a princess of the blood in the British system. She would simply be Lady Catherine Brandrum. She was trading a title that dated back to Charlemagne for the title of a country noblewoman. To the status-obsessed courtiers of Europe, it was a step down, but to Catherine, it was a liberation. The title princess had brought her nothing but fire, exile, and fear. The title Lady Catherine came with a husband she loved and a home that no one would burn down. She signed the papers. She abdicated her own personal throne. The wedding took place on the 21st of April, 1947, in the ballroom of the Royal Palace in Athens, with both Anglican and Orthodox ceremonies. It was the prologue to the massive wedding of Philip and Elizabeth that would happen 7 months later, but it was distinct in its tone. There were no carriage processions. There was no global radio broadcast, but the guest list was a testament to who Catherine really was. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth were there. The young Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret were bridesmaids. Her brother, the new King Paul of Greece, could not come. He was trapped in the civil war in Athens, but he sent his blessing. In the wedding photographs, Catherine wears a dress of heavy satin, a diamond tiara, and an expression of profound, overwhelming relief. Standing next to Richard Brandrum, who looked dashing in his uniform, she does not look like a woman who has lost a kingdom. She looks like a woman who has finally won the war. As the guests toasted the couple with champagne, a subtle shift occurred in the room. The ushers and the footmen, who had bowed to Her Royal Highness when she entered the room, bowed to Lady Catherine when she left it. She walked out of the palace gates and into the London fog, leaving the baggage of the Glucksburg dynasty behind her. She had successfully navigated the minefield of history and reached the other side. But the transition from princess to commoner is not just a matter of changing the stationery. It is a psychological unraveling. Catherine and Richard moved to a house in Eaton Square and later to a cottage in Marlow. For the first time in her life, she had to manage a household without a phalanx of staff. She had to learn to cook. She had to learn to drive a car in traffic. She had to learn to be a neighbor. There is a story that in the early days of her marriage, a shopkeeper in Marlow asked for her name to put on a delivery tab. She instinctively started to say, "Princess," and then stopped, blushed, and said, "Mrs. Brandrum," or "Lady Catherine," whichever is easier. It was a small moment, but it signified the death of the ego. She was learning the rhythm of an ordinary life. However, the past has a way of echoing, even in the quietest cottage. In 1948, she gave birth to her only child, a son named Paul. He was a healthy, happy boy, a grandson of kings who would grow up playing cricket and riding bicycles. But every time Catherine looked at him, she must have felt a flicker of anxiety. She knew how fragile childhood could be. She knew that fire could come from the woods. She raised him with a fierce protectiveness, shielding him from the weight of his ancestry. She wanted him to be a Brandrum, not a Glucksburg. She wanted him to be safe. While her cousin Philip was walking 2 steps behind the Queen, living a life of relentless public scrutiny, Catherine was enjoying the luxury of invisibility. She watched the coronation of 1953 from a seat in the Abbey, seeing the heavy crown of St. Edward placed on Elizabeth's head, and she must have felt a shiver of sympathy. She knew the weight of that gold. She knew what it cost. She went home to Marlow, took off her hat, and made tea for Richard. But the tragedy of the Greek royal family was not done with her yet. Even as she hid in Buckinghamshire, the family she left behind continued to suffer. Her brother Paul, the king, died of cancer in 1964. Her nephew, Constantine II, ascended the throne only to be ousted by a military junta in 1967, sending the family into exile yet again. The Greek curse was still active. Every time another disaster struck Athens, every time another cousin arrived in London with a suitcase and a haunted look, Catherine opened her door. Her home became a sanctuary, a quiet, consoling place where the fallen royals could come to drink whiskey and remember better days. She was the aunt who had escaped, the proof that there was a life after the throne. But as the decades wore on, Lady Katherine Brandrum faced a new challenge, the challenge of irrelevance. The world was moving on. The 1960s brought a cultural revolution that mocked the values she had been raised with. The 1970s brought economic crises. The 1980s brought the celebrity hysteria of Diana. Katherine remained steadfastly, stubbornly analogous. She refused to update her life. She kept the manners of the 1920s. She wrote letters by hand. She dressed in the style of a queen mother. She was becoming a living relic, a curiosity for historians who couldn't believe that a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria was still alive and living in Marlow. As she entered her twilight years, the silence around her deepened. Her siblings were all dead. Her friends were dead. The map of Europe she had known was gone. She was the last leaf on the tree, clinging on through the winter. But she was not afraid of the dark. She had seen the fire, and she knew that the only thing that mattered was who was holding your hand when the lights went out. But time is the one adversary that even a survivor cannot outrun. As the calendar pages turned, shedding the grim austerity of the post-war years for the technicolor noise of the modern age, the sanctuary Katherine had built in Marlow began to feel less like a home and more like a fortress against a world she no longer recognized. The 20th century, which had begun with the slow, stately waltz of empires, was ending in a frantic techno beat, and Katherine was the last dancer left on the floor. She had outlived the revolutions, the wars, and the exiles, but she now faced the slow, inevitable erosion of her own era. The silence she had courted for so long was about to deepen, transforming from a choice into a necessity as the ghosts of the past began to outnumber the friends of the present. By the end of the 20th century, Lady Katherine Brandrum was no longer just an elderly widow. She was a living fragment of a vanished world, the last custodian of memories no one else carried. To the nurses who visited her home to check her blood pressure, or the young postman who delivered her mail, she was a sweet, frail old lady with impeccable manners and a strangely accentless, aristocratic voice. They did not know that the eyes looking back at them, eyes now clouded with age, had once looked into the face of Vladimir Lenin's contemporaries, had seen the Kaiser in his pomp, and had watched the Parthenon burn under the glare of searchlights. She was the silent witness of the European century, sitting in her armchair, surrounded by silver-framed photographs of ghosts who had once ruled half the world. The 1990s were a cruel decade for the concept of monarchy, a time when the mystique of royalty was stripped away by telephoto lenses and tabloid scandals. Katherine watched from her sanctuary in Buckinghamshire as the marriage of her nephew, Prince Charles, and Lady Diana Spencer disintegrated on the public stage. She saw the fires at Windsor Castle in 1992, a terrifying echo of the fire at Tatoy that had scarred her own childhood. She watched the hysteria following Diana's death in 1997. To a woman raised in the stoic, silent courts of the 1910s, this emotional incontinence, as the old guard called it, must have been baffling. Katherine came from a generation that believed suffering was a private affair, a duty to be borne with a stiff spine and a closed mouth. She belonged to the school of Queen Mary, her aunt, who famously said, "We are never tired, and we love hospitals." Katherine did not give interviews about her feelings. She did not write a tell-all book about the trauma of her exile. She simply poured another cup of tea and kept her counsel. But the silence of her final years was shattered by a personal catastrophe that hit harder than any revolution. In 1994, her husband, Richard Brandrum, died after a long illness. For 47 years, he had been her anchor. He was the man who had given her a name that didn't carry a death sentence. He was the man who had taken the princess of the suitcase and given her a permanent address. When he died, the fortress of normality she had built around herself began to crumble. She was 81 years old, and for the first time in half a century, she was truly alone. The Lady Brandrem persona, which she had worn like a protective coat, felt suddenly thinner. The ghost of Princess Katherine began to re-emerge in the quiet, empty rooms of the cottage. In her widowhood, Catherine's world shrank to the dimensions of her garden and her drawing room. But the quality of her solitude was regal. She did not wallow. She possessed that terrifying endurance of the Victoria bloodline. She continued to paint, capturing the landscapes of a peaceful England that had saved her. She continued to correspond with her dwindling circle of friends, but her most frequent visitor was perhaps the most famous woman on earth, Queen Elizabeth II. The Queen and Lady Catherine were close relatives who shared deep family roots, but it was Catherine and Prince Philip who were actually first cousins, both grandchildren of King George I of Greece. But they were more than kin. They were the survivors. They were the last two women who remembered the old world before the war destroyed it. The Queen would often drive herself over from Windsor Castle to Marlow, without fanfare, to sit with Catherine. One can only imagine the conversations between these two elderly women, one carrying the weight of the crown, the other enjoying the lightness of obscurity. They likely did not talk of state affairs. They probably talked of the people only they remembered, of Uncle David, of the smell of the pine trees at Tatoy, of the peculiar madness of their shared relatives. In Catherine, the Queen found a mirror of her own history, a person to whom she did not have to explain anything. Catherine was the keeper of the family secrets, the vault that would never open. But even in the tranquility of Marlow, the Greek curse refused to let Catherine rest completely. In 1994, the socialist government of Greece, in a final act of pettiness against the monarchy, passed a law stripping the royal family of their Greek citizenship and confiscating their remaining properties, including Tatoy. For Catherine, this must have been a bitter pill. Tatoy was not just a royal estate. It was the place where her parents were buried. It was the place she had nearly burned to death. It was the place she had dreamed of during her nights in South Africa. To be told, at the age of 81, that she was no longer Greek, that she was a stateless person in the eyes of her homeland, was a final bureaucratic insult. Yet typically, she made no public statement. She let her nephew, the exiled King Constantine II, fight the legal battles in the European Court of Human Rights. She knew that a piece of paper could not tell her who she was. She carried Greece in her blood, and no parliament could vote that away. As the new millennium dawned, Catherine's physical health began to fail. She became confined to a wheelchair. Her hearing faded. The world outside her window accelerated into the digital age, a world of iPhones, terrorism, and globalization that had no space for 19th century princesses. But as her body weakened, her status as a historical icon grew. Genealogists and royal historians began to realize who exactly was sitting in that cottage. She was the last surviving great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She was the last surviving grandchild of King George I of Greece and Grand Duchess Olga Konstantinovna of Russia. She was a living link to the Romanovs. Her grandmother Olga used to tell her stories about growing up in the Winter Palace before the Bolsheviks were even a whisper. Catherine was the final repository of a civilization that had been swept away. She became the silent witness of Europe's most turbulent century, the last person alive who truly remembered how that lost world had felt from the inside. Catherine was the only person left alive who knew the sound of her father's voice, the man who had been king of Greece during the First World War. She was the only one who remembered the texture of the dress she wore on the ship fleeing Athens in 1917. When she died, those memories would not just be lost, they would be deleted from the human record. She was a library burning down in slow motion. The end came on October 2nd, 2007. It was not dramatic. There were no firing squads, no fleeing ships, no burning forests. There was just the quiet exhale of a 94-year-old woman in her own bed, surrounded by the few people who loved her, not as a historical figure, but as a mother and a grandmother. Lady Katherine Brandrum, formerly Her Royal Highness Princess Catherine of Greece and Denmark, slipped away into the silence she had courted for 60 years. The funeral service held at All Saints Church in Marlow was a surreal collision of two worlds. On one side of the aisle sat the neighbors, the local friends, the people who knew her as the nice lady who liked gardening. On the other side sat the ghosts of the Almanac de Gotha. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip were there, heads bowed. Crown Prince Alexander of Yugoslavia was there. The Crown Prince and Princess of Greece were there. It was a gathering of the tribes, a final muster of the royal houses of Europe to honor one of their own who had defected to the side of normality. But the most poignant detail of the funeral was not the guest list. It was the coffin. It was not draped in the Greek royal standard. It was not topped with a crown. It was adorned with a simple wreath of flowers from her garden. Even in death, she maintained the persona of Lady Brandrum. She did not want to go out as a princess. She wanted to go out as a contented woman. So, what is the final verdict on the autopsy of this extraordinary life? Was Catherine of Greece a failure because she abandoned her title? Was she a coward for hiding in the suburbs while her family fought for thrones? To answer that, we must look at the scoreboard of the Greek royal family. Her father, King Constantine I, died of a broken heart in the exile. Her brother, King Alexander, died of a monkey bite, alone and delirious. Her brother, King George II, died of a heart attack, childless and exhausted by war. Her brother, King Paul, died of cancer, leaving a throne that would soon collapse. Her sister Helen, the Queen of Romania, lived a life of humiliation at the hands of her husband and died in exile. Her sister Irene lived a wandering life and died in exile. Her nephew, King Constantine II, lost his throne and lived for decades in London, dreaming of a return that never happened. Against this litany of tragedy, ruin, and heartbreak, look at Catherine. She stayed married to the same man for 47 years. She raised a son who loved her. She died in her own bed in a country that was safe with money in the bank and peace in her heart. She was not the failure of the family. She was its only true success story. She was the only one who broke the Greek curse. Catherine's life forces us to re-evaluate our definition of strength. We often think of strength as the ability to fight, to hold on to power, to cling to the throne until the bitter end. But Catherine showed us a different kind of strength, the strength to let go. She saw the destructive nature of dynastic ambition. She saw that the crown was not a prize, but a parasite that ate the happiness of those who wore it. And she had the immense courage to say no. She stepped off the carousel. She walked out of the history books and into a life. The hook of her story, the princess who died as a commoner, is the ultimate irony. By becoming a commoner, she achieved the nobility that eluded her royal relatives. She achieved the nobility of a life well lived, a life defined not by what she ruled, but by whom she loved. As we leave her now resting in the quiet earth of the royal necropolis at Tatoi, we should not see her as a tragic figure. We should see her as the wise one, the smart one, the one who got away. Imagine her one last time, not as the old woman in the wheelchair, but as the girl on the deck of the ship in 1922, watching Greece disappear. She was terrified then, stripped of everything. But in that loss, she found the freedom to build something new. She built a sanctuary that no revolution could touch. She was Katherine. And in the end, that was enough.